The Rhodesian Security Forces were the military forces of the Rhodesian government. The Rhodesian Security Forces consisted of a ground force, the Rhodesian Air Force, the British South Africa Police and various personnel affiliated to the Rhodesian Ministry of Internal Affairs. Despite the impact of economic and diplomatic sanctions, Rhodesia was able to develop and maintain a potent and professional military capability. In June 1977, Time magazine reported that man for man, the Rhodesian Army ranks among the world's finest fighting units. The Rhodesian Security Forces of 1964–80 traced the history back to the British South Africa Company Armed Forces, originally created during company rule in the 1880s and 1890s. These became the armed forces of the British self-governing colony of Southern Rhodesia on its formation in 1923, then part of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland military in 1953. After the breakup of the Federation at the end of 1963, the security forces assumed the form they would keep until 1980, as the Armed Forces of Rhodesia. The Rhodesian Security Forces remained loyal to the Salisbury government after it unilaterally declared independence from Britain on the 11th of November, 1965. Britain and the United Nations refused to recognize this, and regarded the breakaway state as a rebellious British colony throughout its existence. The security forces fought on behalf of the unrecognized government against the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, the military wings of the Marxist-Leninist Black Nationalists Zimbabwe African National Union and Zimbabwe African People's Union respectively. During the Rhodesian Bush War of the 1960s and 1970s, the Lancaster House Agreement and the return of Rhodesia to de facto British control on 12 December 1979 changed the security forces' role. Altogether, during the 5-month interim period, they helped the British Governor and Commonwealth Monitoring Force to keep order in Rhodesia while the 1980 general election was organised and held. After the internationally recognised independence of Zimbabwe in April 1980, the Rhodesian Security Forces, ZANLA and ZIPRA, were integrated to form the new Zimbabwe Defence Forces. Rhodesian Army. The majority of the Southern Rhodesia volunteers were disbanded in 1920 for reasons of cost, the last companies being disbanded in 1926. The Defence Act of 1927 created a permanent force and a territorial force as well as national, compulsory military training, with the Southern Rhodesia Volunteers disbanded in 1927. The Rhodesia Regiment was reformed in the same year as part of the nation's territorial force. The 1st Battalion was formed in Salisbury with a detached B Company in Umtali and the 2nd Battalion in Bulawayo with a detached B Company in Gwelo. Between the World Wars, the permanent staff corps of the Rhodesian Army consisted of only 47 men. The British South Africa Police were trained as both policemen and soldiers until 1954. About 10,000 white Southern Rhodesians mustered into the British forces during the Second World War, serving in units such as the Long-Range Desert Group No. 237 Squadron RAF and the Special Air Service. Pro rata to population, this was the largest contribution of manpower by any territory in the British Empire, even outstripping that of Britain itself. Southern Rhodesia's own units, most prominently the Rhodesian African Rifles, fought in the war's East African Campaign and in Burma. During the war, Southern Rhodesian pilots proportionally earned the highest number of decorations and ace appellations in the empire. This resulted resulted in the royal family paying an unusual state visit to the colony at the end of the war in thanks to the efforts of the Rhodesian people. The Southern Rhodesia Air Force was re-established in 1947, and 2 years later, Prime Minister Godfrey Huggins appointed a 32-year-old South African-born Rhodesian Spitfire pilot, Ted Jacklin, as Air Officer Commanding, tasked to build an air force in the expectation that British African territories would begin moving towards independence, and air power would be vital for landlocked Southern Rhodesia. The threadbare SRAF borrowed or salvaged a collection of vintage aircraft, including 6 Tiger Moths, 6 North American Harvard trainers, an Avro Anson freighter and a handful of de Havilland Rapide transport aircraft, before purchasing a squadron of 22 Mk-22 war surplus Supermarine Spitfire from the Royal Air Force, which were then flown to Southern Rhodesia. In April 1951, the Defence Force of Rhodesia was completely reorganized. The permanent force included the BSAP as well as the Southern Rhodesia Staff Corps, charged with training and administering the territorial force. The SRAF consisted of a communication squadron and trained members of the territorial forces pilots, particularly for artillery observation. During the Malayan emergency of the 1950s, Southern Rhodesia contributed 2 units to the Commonwealth's counter-insurgency campaign. The newly formed Rhodesian SHASH served a 2-year tour of duty in Malaya starting in March 1951. Then the Rhodesian African Rifles operated for 2 years from April 1956. The colony also maintained women's auxiliary services, and maintained a battalion of the RA, officered by members of the Staff Corps. The territorial force remained entirely white and largely reproduced the Second World War pattern. It consisted of 2 battalions of the Royal Rhodesia Regiment, an armoured car regiment, artillery, engineers, signal corps, medical corps, auxiliary air force and transport corps. In wartime, the country could also draw on the Territorial Force Reserve and General Reserve. Southern Rhodesia, in other words, reverted more or less to the organization of the Second World War. Matters evolved greatly over 20 years. The regular army was always a relatively small force, but by 1978-79 it consisted of some 10,800 regulars nominally supported by about 40,000 reservists, while the regular army consisted of a professional corps drawn from the white population. By 1978-79 the majority of its complement was actually composed of black soldiers. The Army Reserves, in contrast, were largely white. The Rhodesian Army HQ was in Salisbury and commanded over 4 infantry brigades and later an HQ Special Forces, with various training schools and supporting units. Numbers Chapter 1, 2, and 3 Brigade were established in 1964 and 4 Brigade in 1978. 1 BDE, Bulawayo with area of responsibility in Matabeleland, 2 BDE, Salisbury with area of responsibility in Mashonaland, 3 BDE, Umtali with area of responsibility in Manicaland, 4 BDE, Fort Victoria with area of responsibility in Victoria Province. During the Bush War, the Army included Army Headquarters Army HQ, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, C Squadron SHASH Special Air Service Regiment, Cilliers Scouts, the Rhodesian Armoured Car Regiment, Grey Scouts, the Rhodesian African Rifles, the Rhodesia Regiment, 1 Psychological Operations Unit, the Rhodesian Defence Regiment, the Rhodesian Intelligence Corps, the Rhodesian Artillery, 6 Engineer Squadrons, 1 Anger Squadron, 5 Engineer Support Squadron, 1 Brigade Headquarters abbreviation HQ, 1 BDE Signals Squadron abbreviation 1 SIG Squadron, 2 Brigade Headquarters abbreviation HQ2BDE, Signals Squadron abbreviation 2 SIG Squadron 12 Signals Squadron abbreviation 212 SIG Squadron located Llewellyn Barracks. 3 Brigade Headquarters abbreviation HQ3BDE, Signals Squadron abbreviation 3 SIG Squadron. 4 Brigade Headquarters abbreviation HQ4BDE, 41 Troop Signals Squadron abbreviation 41 TP4SIGSQN. 2 Services Area HQs, 2 Ordnance and Supplies Depots, 2 Base Workshops, 1 Air Supply Platoon, 3 Maintenance Companies, 3 Medical Companies and the Army Health Unit, Sanger Lodge, 5 Provost Platoons and the Army Detention Barracks, 6 Pay Companies, Rhodesian Army Education Corps, Rhodesian Corps of Chaplains, Army Records, and Army Data Processing Unit, Rail Transport Organization Platoon, 1 Military Postal Platoon, Training Establishments, School of Infantry, 19 Corps Training Depot, School of Military Engineering, School of Signals, Services Training School, Services Trade Training Center, Medical Training School, School of Military Police, Pay Corps Training School, School of Military Administration. Rhodesian Air Force. The Rhodesian Air Force was never a large air force. In 1965, it consisted of only 1,200 regular personnel. At the peak of its strength during the Bush War, it had a maximum of 2,300 personnel of all races, but of these, only 150 were pilots actively involved in combat operations. These pilots, however, were rotated through the various squadrons partly to maintain the skills on all aircraft and partly to relieve fellow pilots flying more dangerous sorties. British South Africa Police. The British South Africa Police were the first line of defence in Rhodesia, with the specific responsibility of maintaining law and order in the country. INTAF Rhodesian Ministry of Internal Affairs officers were heavily involved in implementing such civic measures as the Protected Villages Programme. Guard Force. That was the fourth arm of the Rhodesian Security Forces. It consisted of both black and white troops whose initial role was to provide protection for villages in the protected village system. During the latter stages of the Bush War, they provided a role in the protection of white-owned farmland, tribal purchase lands and other strategic locations. They also raised 2 infantry battalions and provided troops in every facet of the war in each of the operational areas. It was a vast force having over 7,200 personnel. Its headquarters were in North Avenue, Salisbury. Its training establishment was based at Chiku Ruby in Salisbury. Combined operations. The Rhodesian Bush War required that each of the security forces work in a combined effort to combat the enemy. Therefore, it became essential to establish an organization known as Combined Operations in Salisbury to coordinate the efforts of each service. The Rhodesian Army took the senior role in Combined Operations. Combined Operations was responsible for the conduct of all operations both inside and outside Rhodesia. Combined Operations had direct command over the joint operational centers deployed throughout the country in each of the operational areas. There was a JOC per operational area. The operational areas were known as Operation Hurricane, Northeast Border, started in December 1972. Operation Thrasher, Eastern Border, started in February 1976. Operation Repulse, Southeast Border, started in May 1976. Operation Tangent, Metaboliland, started in August 1976. Operation Grapple Midlands, started in August 1977. Operation Splinter Kariba, started in June 1978. SALIPS operations in and around Salisbury, started in 1978. Senior military officials in Rhodesia. Source: Original Regiments. Orgvia Web Archive. Commandant, Southern Rhodesia Defence Force, 19 UU Col. George Parson, CBE, DSO 9 October 1936. Brig. John Sidney Morris, CBE, KSDJ at KPM, CPM 1945-1947. March Gen. Storgar Lake, CBE, Chief of the General Staff, 1953. March Gen. Storgar Lake, CBE, the 12th of April 1959. March Gen. Robert Edward Beaumont Long, CBE 1963.06. March Gen. John Anderson, CBE, the 24th of October 1964. March Gen. Rodney Roy Jensen Patrol, CBE 1968.10. March Gen. Keith Robert Costa, OBE, Commander of the Rhodesian Army, the 16th of May 1977. LT Gen. John Selwyn Varco Hickman, CLM, MC, the 6th of March 1979. Commander Zimbabwe Defence Forces, 1981.08. Gen. Andrew Lockhart Charles McLean, Military Equipment of Rhodesia.